Hey there, Brew Crew! Welcome back to The Sixer, my series of shortlist videos. Today, I wanted to talk about my favorite game mechanisms and why I like them. This was an interesting list for me to make because in order to figure out what my favorite game mechanisms are, I had to consider my favorite games and what different mechanisms they use. I did discover something kind of interesting though. As of my last favorite games of all time list, Brass Birmingham was my #1 game. But none of the mechanisms from that game made my list. That's because individually I find all the mechanisms used in Brass to be very good, but it's the way that they are all crafted together that makes that game so special for me. I do want to clarify before I start as well that I tried to stick with the mechanism definitions as they are listed on Board Game Geek. I know that some mechanisms have multiple different names or definitions, but those were kind of the guidelines that I tried to follow. I'm also going to give you some examples of some of my favorite games that use these mechanisms, but most games now have multiple mechanisms all used together. The examples that I give will be games that I think showcase the mechanism well. Alright, let's get started with my number 6. My number 6 favorite mechanism is the auction mechanism. This can be a pretty broad category because there are a lot of different types of auctions, and I tried to narrow it down to just one, but in reality I think I just really like any type of auction game. Two of my favorites are Raw and For Sale, both of which are older games that are still very well loved. Raw is a once-around style auction, and you can see exactly what your opponents are bidding, what their bidding strength will be for each round. So you can try to call an auction at the most advantageous time for you. For Sale is great because it actually has two different auctions. The first half of the game is a traditional around the table in turn order until everyone but one player is passed type of auction, where you're bidding on house cards with different values on them. And then in the second half, there's a sealed bid auction where players will bid house cards in secret and reveal them simultaneously, and then take the highest value money card. I think what I enjoy about auctions so much is that it's a pretty easy concept for most folks to understand. Most people generally know how an auction works, and so explaining the mechanism is not very difficult. But I really love the fact that there are so many different ways to handle auctions in games. It's a really versatile mechanism, so that's why it's my number 6, auctions. My number 5 is variable player powers. You'll find this mechanism in games like Voyages of Marco Polo or Spirit Island. With variable player powers, you start off sometimes with wildly differing abilities. I love a mechanism that will let me do something that no other player can do or break certain rules within the game. I especially love when the powers feel especially powerful, like in Marco Polo. If I take an action that makes another player say, why are you able to do that? Then I know it's a game that I'm probably going to enjoy. Luckily, there are a lot of games out now that use variable player powers, and even a lot of expansions have gone on to add variable player powers to some games that didn't originally include them. So that's why it's my number 5 favorite mechanism, variable player powers. My number 4 is the time track. This mechanism is in games like Tokaido and Glenmore. This mechanism has you moving down a track to a space to take goods, tiles, or actions. The catch is that the person who is farthest behind on the track is always the next player to go, which means that if you've moved too far ahead, you may giving up multiple turns to your opponent while they take all of the spaces in between. I think that Glenmore adds another really cool twist to the mechanism because, yes, if you are the farthest behind, you get to take a bunch of tiles and build up a really nice engine, but you're going to lose points at the end of the game for each tile that you have more than the player that has the least amount of tiles. So it makes for difficult decisions either way, and apparently I enjoy difficult decisions. So that's my number 4, the time track. All right. I think that worker placement would end up on a lot of folks' list of favorite mechanisms, but I decided to go a little bit more specific, and so my number 3 is dice worker placement. You'll find this in games like Endangered and Rajas of the Ganges. Worker placement already has some tense moments where you are hoping that no one takes the space that you need, but if you add in rolling dice to determine where or at what strength you'll be able to take your actions, that tension is turned up to 11. Now, if your dice rolls are anything like mine, this can often mean that you won't be able to do the thing that you wanted to do this round. But I love when a game makes me pivot like that and basically figure out what's best to do with what I've rolled. How do I manage to get the best out of what I've been given? That is a very fun puzzle for me to try and solve, so that's why my number 3 favorite mechanism is dice worker placement. My number 2 favorite game mechanism is dice drafting. Now this isn't technically its own category on BGG, but it's sort of a subset of action drafting. You can see this mechanism at work in games like Grand Austria Hotel and Pulsar 2849. If I didn't make it clear when talking about my number 3, I don't have the greatest luck when it comes to rolling dice. That's why dice drafting ranks slightly above dice worker placement for me. You still have a lot of the tension of hoping you get the right action, hoping that it'll be available to you for that round, but all the dice are rolled at the beginning of the round, and so there's less pressure on me to roll exactly what I need. Often the die that you decide to take will affect some other aspect of the game as well. For example, in Grand Austria Hotel, the actions get weaker as more dice are drafted from a specific action. In Pulsar, drafting a die from one side or the other of the median die will cause you to move up or down on certain tracks. So, while it doesn't rely as heavily on the outcome of an individual die roll, there's still a lot of things to consider. So that's why I have dice drafting as my number 2 favorite game mechanism. Okay, finally, my number 1 game mechanism is multi-use cards. This shows up in games like La Granja and Beer and Bread. All throughout this list, I've talked about mechanisms that create a sense of tension, and without a doubt, my favorite form of tension in a game comes from figuring out what to do with multi-use cards. Should I use this card to gather resources, make a delivery, gain a special power? Usually you want to use it for all of these, but I really love having to make that decision. I especially like the way that multi-use cards are used in La Granja because the player boards give you multiple places to slot in your cards depending on where you put them. It will activate different card abilities. So you might want to use it for crops, or as a farm extension, as an ability, or as a contract ready to be fulfilled. It's such a cool concept, and definitely what elevates La Granja to one of my favorite games of all time. So that's my number 1 favorite game mechanism, multi-use cards. Alright everyone, that's it for this Sixer. In the comments below, make sure to let me know what your favorite games are that use these mechanisms, and also let me know what some of your favorite game mechanisms are. I'm sure there are a lot of great ones out there that I didn't mention. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and until next time, let's get another round for the table.